Let no man deceive you with vain words, for because of these things cometh the wrath of God upon the children of disobedience. Be not ye therefore partakers with them. For ye were sometimes darkness, but now are ye light in the Lord. Walk as children of light. And there came one of the 7 angels which had the 7 vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither, I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness. And I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. And I saw the woman drunken with the blood of the saints and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. And when I saw her, I wondered with great admiration. And the angel said unto me, Wherefore didst thou marvel? I will tell thee the mystery of the woman and of the beast that carrieth her, which hath the 7 heads and 10 horns.
Et in odorem suavitatis acceptus, supernis luminaribus misceatur. Flammas eius, Lucifer matutinus inveniat. Ille, in quam Lucifer, qui nescito casum, Christus filius tuus, qui regressus ab inferis, humano generis serenus iluxit, et tecum vivit et regnat in saecula saeculorum.
And have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. For it is a shame even to speak of those things which are done of them in secret. But all things that are reproved are made manifest by the light. For whatsoever doth make manifest is light. Wherefore he saith, Awake, thou that sleepest, and arise from the dead, and Christ shall give thee light.
Nella Chiesa non esiste il fai da te, non esistono battitori liberi. Quante volte Papa Benedetto ha descritto la Chiesa come un noi ecclesiale. Talvolta capita di sentire qualcuno dire io credo in Dio, credo in Gesù, ma la Chiesa non mi interessa. Quante volte abbiamo sentito questo? Questo non va. c'è chi ritiene di poter avere un rapporto personale, diretto, immediato con Gesù Cristo, al di fuori della comunione e della meditazione della Chiesa. Sono tentazioni pericolose, sono tentazioni dannose, sono, come diceva il grande Paolo VI, dicotomie assurde.
Hi there, my name is Alan Lamont. This video is an explanation of why I do believe that Pope Francis is the Black Pope, the superior Jesuit general, called by Jesuits the Father General. The general of the Jesuits is elected for life, but over the last few decades we've saw two generals resign. We have Pedro Rupi resigned before Hans Kolvenbach was positioned as the Black Pope. Then he resigned in 2008 for Father Adolfo Nicolas from Spain to be elected as the Superior General of the Society of Jesus by the 35th Congregation of the Jesuit Curie in Rome. Now if you go on the Jesuit website called the Jesuit Curie in Rome, I'll put this page on so you can see it now. It's called the House of the Superior General. And on the left there at the bottom you will see an article for Pope Francis. On the 31st of July 2013, quote, "It was a historical moment for all Jesuits in Italy and around the world." Now why was it historic? I'll explain that, but let me continue this quotation. It was a historical moment for all Jesuits in Italy and around the world to have Pope Francis presiding over the feast day Mass of St. Ignatius of Loyola. The spectacular view of more than 200 Jesuits from Italy, along with Father General and his council members, concelebrating with the Pope, and over 600 religious and lay collaborators participating in this event. Now, we have today a very unusual situation. We've entered a time that we've never entered before in regard to the Jesuit order. Now, going back to 2008, Peter Hans Kolvenbach was the Jesuit general of the Jesuit order. He was the superior general of the Society of Jesus. And he resigned, supposedly, according to reasons of ill health. And then Father Adolfo Nicolas Pachin was positioned to be the superior general of the Jesuits. That's in 2008. And so with everyone looking at the Jesuits over the last few years, exposing the fact that they do control the New World Order, they're behind the Vatican, they're behind the One World Government, they're behind all of these interlocking groups that govern the New World Order. It's the Jesuits that have global governance. They control the One World Government. And the Jesuits realised that eventually people would be aware of this, because they're positioning their presidents and prime ministers out for all to see, and people will eventually realise that they're all Jesuit alumni, they all come from Jesuit universities, they're all under the power of the Pope of Rome, they're all Vatican Knights. Really what I'm saying is this: eventually people would realise that really the Jesuits do control all governments. They have complete control over the governments of the earth, because, I mean, even look at the European Union, look at Herman von Rompuy, you know, he's Jesuit trained from a Jesuit alumni university. This is how the Jesuits have the power they do, is through education. And so eventually they would position a Pope of Rome to be a Jesuit, to be a high Jesuit. Pope Francis, obviously Bergoglio, was a high Jesuit provincial from Argentina. Okay, let me go back to Hans Kolvenbach and let me explain this revelation to you. But I had to share that just to lay a foundation for this message. Now, if you look into Hans Kolbenbach, he was positioned by Pedro Arrupi, the Jesuit general, and the Jesuits are known as the company. Okay, they're called Jesuits by Protestants, but really they are the company, not of Jesus, but just they're the company. They are Knights of the Virgin, the Knights Templars. The Knights Templars were not destroyed. Peter Hans Kolbenbach resigned in 2008, and Adolfo Nicholas was positioned to be the Black Pope. So everyone exposing the Jesuits, everyone exposing the Black Pope in the anti-Vatican movement, they all believed that Adolfo Nicholas was the Jesuit general. Officially he was positioned. I believe that myself. I brought that revelation out for over 2 years, you know. But then something unusual happened. We had the Pope of Rome, Pope Benedict, the White Pope, resign in March, and we had Pope Francis positioned as a High Jesuit Provincial over the whole of South America to be the Sovereign Pontiff, to be the Bishop of Rome, to be the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church Universal. So from 2008 to 2013, what we have is we have a Black Pope, Kolbenbach, resign, Adolfo Nicholas positioned, we have a White Pope resign, and we have a Jesuit High Provincial positioned as the Pope of Rome. You see, so officially, all that people are going to do is look at Adolfo Nicholas. And of course he is a High Jesuit on the Jesuit Council, but he is not the Black Pope. He was merely brought out and brought forth to bring diversion away from the fact that for the first time in history, the Jesuits have a Black Pope who has become the White Pope. That's what's happened. I am 100% convinced of that, and the more that I dig into this revelation, the more convinced I am every day of it. This is what's happened. This is what the Jesuits have done. And they always work in harmony. That's how they work when they operate this way. That's their modus operandi. They always work together in harmony. That's how you know that this is a work of the Jesuits. Pope Francis being positioned. He's not just a High Jesuit Provincial. No, he's not. He came into the Jesuit order in 1953, and he was overseen by Pedro Arrupi, and he worked with Hans Kolbenbach on the Jesuit Curia in Rome from the Church of the Jesuit. What you're looking at in this picture here is you're looking at Adolfo Nicholas in subordination. Now that is not just, you know, staged in that sense. That's real. You're looking at Adolfo Nicholas, who is subordinate to his general, who is Pope Francis. And we see here in these pictures that Father Adolfo Nicholas is not wearing his Jesuit general garments the way that he normally does, because he's standing before the general. He's dressed like an ordinary provincial. He's dressed as an ordinary High Jesuit on the Jesuit Curia, on the Jesuit High Council, because that's all he is. I believe he governs the Curia, but he's not the general of the company. And if Jesuits are listening to this, you'll understand what I'm saying when I say harmony. This is the way the Jesuits work. You have a Black Pope resign, Kolbenbach. You have Adolfo Nicholas positioned in the middle of this operation so that everyone officially sees him as the superior Jesuit general. So that when Pope Benedict resigns, suddenly no one was prepared for that, and then we have Pope Francis being ordained as the Pope of Rome. So this is the way the Jesuits work. Always in deception, always in diversion. That's how they work. Okay. Now I've had to explain that, and I'm not going to make this a long video, but I felt responsible to really explain that, because sometimes in the videos that I'm bringing out I don't go into it a lot And I have to remember that a lot of people don't have this revelation, and it's only really just really analysing this a couple of months ago that I realised exactly what the Jesuit Curia have done here. And it's very shrewd and it's very devious, but this is what they've done. They've positioned a black pope to be the head of the Jesuits, and also to govern the Vatican as the white pope. It's never happened before. But the only way they could do it, this is the only way they could do it, is to have Hans Kornbach resign. And he chose Adolfo Nicholas to be put forth as diversion, so that when Pope Francis becomes the Pope of Rome, no one would know that he's the Black Pope, no one would suspect that he's the Jesuit general, because Adolfo Nicholas is the general. But you see the harmony here, the harmony. That's the key to understanding this, the harmony. Okay. So we have a Black Pope today who is the Superior General of the Jesuits. Let me bring a conclusion. The Jesuits of Rome do control the world. I'm not going to go deep into that, that's in all of my other work. But the Jesuits do control the world. They control every government. They control the monarchies. They control the presidents, the prime ministers, the heads of state, because they're all graduated from Jesuit universities. They're all alumni, graduates. That's the only way that you're given power at the top. No other way. No other way. I'm not saying they're high Jesuits. It takes 30 to 40 years to be a Jesuit that has power in this command structure. Or, let me rephrase that, in this chain of command, because it is an army. It's a military order. They're the soldiers of Loyola, it's an army. And when you read the Jesuit oath, and it is the real oath of induction, or what's known as the fourth vow, or extreme oath of induction, that's where you see the real revelation of the New World Order. To overthrow governments, to have a one world government where all nations are subordinate to the Pope. And here we have the Pope of Rome, Pope Francis, out in the open now. He's not just a high Jesuit provincial, so every time you have, say, Obama or Herman von Rompuy or Angela Merkel or any of these world leaders, when they come to the Vatican and they bow in subordination to the Pope, they're not bowing just to a Jesuit provincial, they're actually showing open subordination to the Black Pope. He's ruled the governments covertly, secretly for the last couple of hundred years, you know. This is a secret alliance, this is a secret covenant between the monarchies. It's also known as the Holy Alliance. That's another name for it. So the monarchies, the Catholic bloodline, the Catholic sovereigns, they're already under the power of the Black Pope. They have been for hundreds of years. And the Jesuits will put to death and assassinate any president, any monarch, anyone, any head of state, any politician that defies Rome. You see, the Jesuits worked through the popes of Rome for hundreds of years in order to control the governments of the earth, and now they have complete control. The Black Pope is coming forth as the White Pope. It's obvious what's happened. At some point that we're going to do this. This is the end game. It's obvious. Do you think the Black Pope is always going to be in the shadows? Of course he controls all governments covertly and secretly, but do you think he's always going to be in that position? Of course not. Ultimately, he's going to come forth as the Black Pope. They destroyed the power of the papacy generations ago. The last pope to resist them was Pope John Paul I, and he was not killed because of a P2 Masonic scandal. Don't believe that by Jesuit coadjutor David Yallop. No, they were killed by the Society of Jesus because he wanted to bring restraints upon the Jesuits. He wanted to limit the power of the general, and for that, once the Jesuits realised that, he was put to death very quickly after 30 days. Conclusion. If you want to ask questions, go ahead, leave comments. It's something that's very deep. What we're talking about is very deep, and but there's multi levels to this New World Order conspiracy. But what I'm revealing to you now is the truth. I've spent 3 years sometimes just working day after day after day after day to dig into this conspiracy, and I respect other researchers that I've had contact with, like Eric John Phelps and Craig Oxley, and we'll all differ on different issues, but the truth of the matter is the Black Pope is the one that controls the world. He controls all the Vatican knighthoods, he controls the papal bloodlines of Italy, and they have more power than the Rothschilds. But okay, thank you for watching the video, and as always, all roads lead to Rome.
Now I've got to admit I'm not so good with economics and the world of finance. The complexities of it are just too confusing. But maybe that's the point. Maybe it's meant to be too confusing for the average person, just like it suited the Catholic Church to keep the Bible too confusing for anyone to understand, so that they became the information guardians and could get away with whatever they liked. Maybe it suits bankers to have us ignorant of what they are up to as well. Remember the quotation from the anonymously authored Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars, which said, "The bookkeeper can be king if the public can be kept ignorant of the methodology of the bookkeeping." In the next couple of parts, I want to highlight how our money markets and banking systems are far more manipulated than we might imagine, and that most things that happen within them happen by design, not by chance. In his book, The Coming Economic Armageddon, which I'd highly recommend, David Jeremiah writes about some puzzling things that happened in the aftermath of the economic crash that hit in 2009. He says that failed institutions such as Bank of America, JP Morgan, Citibank and Goldman Sachs managed to pay back their billions of dollars in bailout funds early. Then, amazingly, in the first quarter of 2010, not one of these banking giants posted a loss. A virtually impossible feat equivalent to 4 Major League pitchers, each pitching a perfect game on the same day. How was such an astounding turnaround even possible? Was some kind of manipulation going on here? Some suspect it was a pre-planned event. He goes on to say, and then there is the strange case of the stock market flash crash miracle of early May 2010. If you're a market watcher, you may have experienced simultaneously apoplexy and angina as the stock market took a frightening bungee ride that Thursday. Call it panic buying, a plunge, a market correction, or some other euphemism, the Dow Jones posted its greatest intraday loss since the crash of 1987. After 2:30 p.m., in just 5 minutes, the Dow dropped 400 to 800 points. It went on to lose nearly 1,000 points in that precipitous dive. At 2:40 p.m., the descent stopped with a curious and startling upward jerk as if the bungee cord had reached its nadir and its rider was sent vaulting back up to the apex. By 3:40 p.m., the Dow had recovered 383.17 points, an almost miraculous recovery in less than an hour. A financial miracle? Maybe not. It would appear there might have been intervention by a behind-the-scenes committee. Again, this isn't my favourite subject, but the economy is so fundamental to what's happening in the world today that we need to cover it. Let's try to understand this a little bit by working through a timeline. Back during the French Revolution in 1790, a man called Mayer Rothschild lived in Frankfurt, Germany, which was the birthplace of the Illuminati, if you'll remember. It has been suggested that the Rothschild family were in fact the financial backers to Adam Weishaupt. The Rothschild family had become incredibly rich by lending money to royalty, particularly Prince William IX of Hesse-Hanau. They discovered that lending to governments and monarchies was far more profitable than lending to individuals. The loans were far bigger and they were secured against the taxes of the people, making them relatively risk-free. This practice gave Mayer Rothschild big ideas, and around that time he made the bold statement that if he could control a nation's money, he could control the nation, regardless of who the political leader was at the time. Just a year later, in 1791, he put his plans into effect by establishing the first bank of the United States. That bank was given a 20-year charter by the American government through a man called Alexander Hamilton, who had served in George Washington's cabinet. Meyer Rothschild also gave his son, Nathan, £20,000 to establish a central bank in London, England. This became known as the Bank of England. Another son, Jacob or James, was told to do the same in France. Another son, Kalman, set up one in Naples for Italy, and finally, Salomon was sent to do the same in Vienna. Remember John Robinson's word from Proofs of Conspiracy. The primary goal of the Illuminist is to get the possession of riches, power and influence without industry, i.e. without working for it. Well, that's basically what money lenders do. They create money out of thin air, lend it at interest and receive more back without any effort on their part. This is called usury. It was outlawed in the Bible, but today the entire economy is based on it. Let me try to explain. This is a moneylender called Meyer, and this is another guy called John. They live in a brand new country called Freeland. Meyer goes to the newly formed government of Freeland and asks to establish a central bank to issue the currency of the country. The central bank will be privately owned and run. The government agrees. Now John decides he wants to build a house here in Freeland, but no money exists yet, so he goes to Meyer at the central bank and asks for $100 Freeland dollars to build it. Meyer gives him that $100 loan, which represents an immediate debt. That paper money basically says, you are in debt by this much. But on top of the $100, Meyer charges John a 10% interest rate which must be paid back over 10 years. That means that in total, John will have to work to pay back $158.40 over 10 years on the original principal debt of $100. The problem is, there's only $100 in circulation because that's all the Central Freeland Bank has printed. So how does John pay back $158.40 when there's only $100 in circulation? More money needs to be printed so that there's enough in circulation to cover the interest. So John goes back to the bank to ask them to print another $58.40 to loan him so that he can pay back the original debt. The bank conjures that $58.40 out of thin air and issues it to John, but at interest. They want 10% over 10 years on that money as well. So he's now in debt to the tune of $192.40. But there's only $158.40 in the system. So John goes back to ask for more to cover the shortfall again. They issue that at interest as well, and so on and so on. Under this system, there is never enough money in the system to pay off all debts. It keeps John in a perpetual state of debt to the bank. The only way he can meet his payments is if the bank issues more, which puts him further into debt. It's a spiral that grows exponentially and will eventually get out of control. John has to work harder and harder to generate more and more money without ever getting the benefit of it himself. The bank owns more and more of his labour, and more of his earnings are consumed by the repayments. Eventually John will fall into a state of exhaustion and will have to default on his loan, at which point the bank comes in and takes all his tangible assets, such as the house he has built and the land it sits on. So the bank has given out of this nothingness these pieces of paper or numbers on a computer screen that are worth nothing to John, and in return they have sucked up all his real solid, tangible assets that have intrinsic worth. They have gained riches without industry, without working for it. In the process they have also made a slave out of John, who has worked all his days trying to keep up with repayments. They have been parasites on his life. They have been getting richer in the process and leaving him with less and less. That's effectively what is happening in the world today, except the government is a middleman between the bank and John. John being us, the people. Governments borrow money from privately owned central banks who charge them interest for the privilege. The governments are then instantly in debt, and because the debt has compound interest on it, they need the central bank to issue more money to cover that interest, which they do, also at interest, and the whole thing gets into a spiral. There is never enough money in the system, and there never can be. It was designed that way, because it means that way we can never be debt-free. Never being debt-free keeps us in slavery to the banks. The government then charges their citizens more and more tax to try and keep up with the interest payments to the banks. This means the citizens have to work harder and harder with less and less personal reward. With the sweat of their brow they generate goods and services to sell, only for increasing amounts of their income to be vacuumed up in taxes and debt repayments through the system to the central bank. The citizens become impoverished and enslaved, and the central bank grows wealthier and fatter. A two-tier system is created like that proposed by Plato. Those at the top get richer and the rest get poorer. In the meantime, as the debt spirals, we need to work more, sell more, generate more, consume more. Our businesses try to find new markets, expand into new territories, consuming and destroying more and more of the earth's resources on the way. People in the new markets might not need what we're selling, but we need to sell it to them, so we need to convince them that they need it. Consumerism and materialism spirals out of control. Adverts lie and tell us we need their thing to make us happy, and then when we buy it, they release a newer, better version a year later, and then they tell us we need that one instead. At times, the bank issues credit freely to encourage the spending spiral, and then, when they feel like it, when everyone is loaded with debt, they can contract the money supply, cause a depression in the economy which causes millions of citizens to default on home payments or car payments, all the stuff they've been buying but haven't really been able to afford, at which point the bank steps in and takes control of those hard, valuable assets, and the people are left in poverty. The endless growth that means new money has to be constantly pumped into the system also means the currency becomes increasingly worthless. This is called inflation. A couple of generations ago, one parent could go out to work and provide more than enough for a family of 5. Today, 2 parents working sometimes barely cover the cost of living. Nothing in nature indulges in endless growth like this except for cancer, and that is far from healthy. Left unchecked, it causes death to its host. Likewise, there is not a single civilization in history that based its economic system on usury that didn't collapse into an exhausted heap in the end. There is no escape from it. That will happen to us too. Our whole economic system is headed for a huge collapse, and when it does, the elite money men will step in to snap up the valuable resources and consolidate global assets in the hands of a few. This would create a global two-tier system. What we have felt thus far are only tremors. There is something much bigger ahead. Remember the moment in Matthew 21 when Jesus arrived in the temple and found the moneylenders there. He got about as angry as Jesus is ever recorded to have been. He knocks over their tables and chases them out of there, calling them a den of thieves. That's what usury is. It's theft. In Proverbs 22:7, the Bible says that the rich rule over the poor, the borrower is a slave to the lender. We are all slaves to central banks now, which is why we are taxed at every turn. Our government is slave to those bankers too. They form a shadow government, just like Mayor Rothschild boasted about in 1790. Democracy is an illusion under this system. Most of us will also have car repayments, mortgages, or will have taken out credit on some other large purchase. It has been reported that Americans today now pay more tax than 19th century slaves and medieval serfs. If the borrower is slave to the lender, are any of us really free? Or did we just come to love our servitude because it was comfortable, like Aldous Huxley suggested we would? I've done my best to explain as far as I can understand, but like I said, economics isn't my forte at all. So what I've done is copied links to a few websites below that should help explain the situation in black and white. I should add I don't necessarily agree with everything on those pages and in those sites, but it will give you a good idea of what's going on. Finally, although my financial advice is admittedly worth very little, I would suggest that as our paper money becomes increasingly worthless and may one day soon collapse completely, it might be an idea to invest in something with real value, such as gold or silver. We should also try to pay off our private debts as soon as possible and to live as debt-free as we possibly can. So in our timeline in 1791, Mayer Rothschild had been given a charter to establish the First Bank of America. By 1811 this charter had expired and Congress voted against its renewal. Nathan Rothschild was not impressed and threatened. Either the application for the renewal of the charter is granted, or the United States will find itself involved in a most disastrous war. The United States stood firm, leading Nathan Rothschild to issue another threat that he would teach those impudent Americans a lesson. In 1812, therefore, backed by the money and wishes of Nathan, Britain declared war on the United States. The Rothschild plan was not to win the war for Britain, but simply to cause the USA to build up such a debt in fighting the war that they would have to allow the Rothschild bank charter to be renewed. This plan succeeded. In 1816, the Second Bank of the United States was established and given another 20-year charter. Thousands of British and American soldiers had died, but the Rothschilds got their bank. Around this time, the great patriarch of the family, Mayer Rothschild, died, leaving specific written demands for all those who would follow him. All the key positions in the Rothschild business interest were to be held by male family members only. The family was to intermarry with first and second cousins only as well. Many of these were arranged marriages. As well as preserving the purity of the bloodline, this would ensure that the family fortune would stay within their control. Consequently, of the 18 marriages by Mayer's children, 16 were with first cousins. Also, no public inventory of his estate was ever to be published. People were never to know just how wealthy and just how far-reaching their influence was becoming. The British war on America had proven very profitable, and so the Rothschilds repeated the trick by manipulating the Napoleonic Wars for their own ends. Nathan funded the Duke of Wellington through the Bank of England, while his brother James, who had been sent to Paris to start a central bank there, used their money to fund Napoleon. This war again generated massive risk-free debt for the Rothschilds. During the war, they also saw an opportunity to set up an unrivaled postal and courier service, who were to be allowed through both French and English blockades. It was these couriers who kept Nathan up to date with events, so that he could use that intelligence to manipulate the stock exchange. So good were these couriers that the news from the Battle of Waterloo was delivered to Nathan Rothschild a full 24 hours before Wellington's own courier. Being a day ahead of the curve, Nathan played a clever trick. At that time, British bonds were called consols, and upon hearing Britain had won the war, Nathan began selling all his consols. This made the other traders believe the British had lost the war, and in a frantic panic they started selling too. The effect of this was that the consols plummeted in value. Nathan then discreetly told all his workers to start buying up the consols they could lay their hands on. When news came through that the British had in fact won the war the next day, the value of the consols skyrocketed, giving Nathan a 20-to-1 return on his investment. Feeling rather pleased with himself at this stage, Nathan made this famous statement: "I care not what puppet is placed on the throne of England to rule the empire on which the sun never sets. The man who controls Britain's money supply controls the British Empire, and I control the British money supply." He went on to brag that in the 17 years he had been in England, he had turned the £20,000 given to him by his father into £50 million, which is a huge sum by today's standards, let alone theirs. So powerful were the Rothschilds at this juncture that they used their control of the Bank of England to change the whole monetary system. Instead of shipping gold from country to country to pay for goods and services, which was costly and risky, they simply held the gold in their secure banks across the world and instead issued paper debits and credits. Now people only had to hand over a piece of official paper which was backed by the gold held in secure locations. This is the origin of paper money that we have today. The past century had clearly been very profitable for the family. In fact, it became known as the Age of the Rothschilds, and it was by this point that some estimated them to own over half the world's wealth. These wars were also achieving gradual synthesis by the Hegelian principle. In 1814, the Congress of Vienna was called to settle the issues arising from the Napoleonic Wars, Vienna being the place where Salomon Rothschild had been posted. So out of the war of two sides, an attempt at synthesis was made. This became a model for the League of Nations and the United Nations, which would follow a century later after World Wars I and II respectively. The Vienna Congress was intended to create a blueprint for how a world government might be achieved. As many of the European countries were now in massive debt to the Rothschilds' bank because of these wars, they could use this as a bargaining tool. However, the Congress of Vienna was scuppered by Tsar Alexander in Russia, who did not yet have a central Rothschild-owned bank. Enraged by this, Nathan Rothschild swore to exact revenge on the Tsar's descendants. In 1817, the French took out massive loans to rebuild the country after the war. Rothschild agents then bought up vast amounts of French government bonds, causing their value to increase. On November the 5th, 1818, they dumped them all in the open market, causing their values to plummet and France to go into a financial panic. The Rothschild then stepped in to take control of the French money supply. In 1821, Kalman Rothschild was sent to Italy to do business with the Vatican and the Pope. By 1823, they had taken over the financial operations of the Catholic Church worldwide. In 1827, Sir Walter Scott published his works on the life of Napoleon. In Volume 2 of the 9-volume set, he confirmed the French Revolution was planned by the Illuminati and that it was financed by the money changers of Europe, that being the Rothschilds. In 1832 in America, President Andrew Jackson ran the campaign for his second term in office under the slogan, "Jackson and no bank." This was in reference to his desire to take control of the American money system away from the Rothschild central bank and instead create a financial system that benefited the people. A year later, he stayed true to his word and started removing all deposits from their banks. This caused the Rothschild to panic and they contracted the money supply, causing a depression. Jackson knew what was going on and echoed Jesus' words when he declared, "You are a den of thieves and vipers, and I intend to rout you out, and by the eternal God I will rout you out." On January 30th, 1835, a hired assassin tried to shoot President Jackson, but miraculously both his pistols misfired. President Jackson later claimed he knew the Rothschilds were behind the assassination attempt. The assassin himself, Richard Lawrence, later bragged that powerful people in Europe had hired him and promised to protect him if caught. Lawrence was indeed found not guilty by reason of insanity and escaped punishment. In 1836, Jackson finally succeeded in throwing the Rothschild Central Bank out of America when the charter was not renewed. In 1841, President John Tyler vetoed an attempt to reinstate the charter for the Bank of the United States. Following this act, he was sent hundreds of assassination threats. Benjamin Disraeli, future British Prime Minister, described Nathan Rothschild at this time as the lord and master of the money markets of the world, and of course, virtually lord and master of everything else. He literally held the revenues of southern Italy in pawn, and monarchs and ministers of all countries courted his advice and were guided by his suggestions. Disraeli also referenced these infamous occultists when he said, "The world is run by people very different to those that most people are aware of." In 1845, President Jackson died, but before his death he was asked what his greatest achievement was. His reply, "I killed the bank." In 1846, Meyer Rothschild's wife said nonchalantly from her deathbed that, "If my sons did not want wars, there would be none." In 1850, James Rothschild of France was said to be worth 600 million francs, 150 million francs more than all the other bankers of France put together. In 1861, Abraham Lincoln, 16th President of the United States, began printing his own debt-free money and informed the public it was legal tender for all private and public debts. By the following year, close to $450 million had been printed and distributed. Lincoln would say of this that, "We gave the people of this republic the greatest blessing they ever had, their own paper money to pay all debt costs." That same year, the Times of London said, "If that mischievous financial policy which had its origin in the North American Republic should become indurated down to a fixture, then that government will furnish its own money without cost. It will pay off debts and be without a debt. It will have all the money necessary to carry on its commerce. It will become prosperous beyond precedent in the history of the civilized governments of the world. The brains and the wealth of all countries will go to North America. That government must be destroyed or it will destroy every monarchy on the globe." In 1865, Lincoln highlighted the danger of the money man, saying, "I have two great enemies, the Southern Army in front of me and the financial institutions in my rear. Of the two, the one in my rear is the greatest." Later that year, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. Following a brief period of training in the Rothschild London Bank, a man called Jacob Schiff, a Rothschild born in their house in Frankfurt, was sent to the United States with the task to regain control of the United States through a central bank. He was to find desirable men and promote them to high places in federal government. In 1875, Jacob Schiff took control of the major banking house, Kuhn Loeb & Co., and formed associations with the other major bankers in the United States. In 1881, American President Garfield hinted at the way the Rothschild manipulated the money market, saying, "Whoever controls the volume of money in our country is absolute master of all industry and commerce. And when you realize the entire system is very easily controlled, one way or another, by a few powerful men at the top, you will not have to be told how periods of inflation and depression originate." In 1891, the British Labour leader made these statements regarding the Rothschilds. "This blood-sucking crew has been the cause of untold mischief and misery in Europe during the present century, and has piled up its prodigious wealth chiefly through fomenting wars between states which ought never to have quarrelled. Whenever there is trouble in Europe, wherever rumours of war circulate and men's minds are distraught with fear of change and calamity, you may be sure that a hook-nosed Rothschild is at his game somewhere near the region of the disturbance." Comments like these worried the Rothschilds, and towards the end of the century they bought the Reuters news agency to gain some control of the media, that is, the information flows. Reuters became a central source of news that supplied individual outlets around the world with news it wanted to be known. In the 20th century, the next generation of Rothschilds became obsessed with the idea of returning Jews to their homeland in Israel. James Rothschild's youngest son, Edmund, initiated the process by funding the building of Jewish colonies in what had become known as Palestine. In 1897, the Zionist Congress was formed with the intention of promoting the establishment of a Jewish nation. It intended to meet in Munich, Germany, but when the local Jews heard about it, they protested so much that it had to be moved to Basel in Switzerland. The reason for the protest was that the Jews were quite comfortable in their adopted countries and had no intention of moving back. This led the chairman of the meeting, Theodor Herzl, to state, "It is essential that the suffering of Jews become worse. This will assist in the realization of our plans. I have an excellent idea. I shall induce anti-Semites to liquidate Jewish wealth. The anti-Semites will assist us thereby in that they will strengthen the persecution and oppression of the Jews. The anti-Semites will be our best friends." So there was a conscious decision to have people turn on the Jews to make them uncomfortable in their adopted countries, so that they would then have motivation to leave and go back to their homeland. Herzl was thereafter elected as the president of the Zionist organization, which adopted a red hexagram as their emblem. In 1901, the Jewish colonists began to feel like Edmund Rothschild was more of a hindrance than a help. They asked him to take a step back from the process to let them handle their own situation. Rothschild, demonstrating the controlling spirit of Jezebel, angrily retorted, "I created the Yishuv, I alone. Therefore no man, neither colonists or organizations, have the right to interfere in my plans." A couple of years later, in 1903, the Zionist Congress astonishingly appeared to hint at World War I a full 11 years before it actually took place. Max Nordau said at this meeting, "Let me tell you the following words as if I were showing you the rungs of a ladder leading upward and upward. Herzl, the Zionist Congress, the English-Uganda Proposition, the future World War, the Peace Conference, where, with the help of England, a free and Jewish Palestine will be created." How did they know about a future world war ahead of time? Well, interestingly, Albert Pike had talked about 3 future world wars way back in 1871. He wrote a letter to Giuseppe Mazzini, dated 15th of August, whereby he claimed he had received a vision. In that vision he had been told of 3 world wars that were to come. Each of them would work on the Hegelian principle, where they would clash 2 opposing ideologies together to create a specific outcome that would further the plans for a new world order. It should, however, be noted that the existence of this letter is now denied, and there is no hard and fast evidence that it actually exists. Jacob Schiff, meanwhile, was working away at regaining control of America's finances. In 1907 he made a speech to the New York Chamber of Commerce, warning those present that, Unless we have a central bank with adequate control of credit resources, this country is going to undergo the most severe and far-reaching money panic in its history. It may have been more of a threat than a warning. In 1913, the Rothschilds finally managed to get their way and established a third central bank of America, which was called the Federal Reserve. That's the Central American Bank that still exists today. Shortly before the act was passed, Congressman Charles Lindbergh stated that the act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When the President signs this bill, the invisible government of the monetary power will be legalized. The greatest crime of the ages is perpetrated by this banking and currency bill. The President at the time, Woodrow Wilson, later acknowledged his terrible mistake, saying, "I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world. No longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men." The Federal Reserve is today conservatively estimated to make $150 billion a year, but it has never had to publish any accounts, true to the wishes of Meyer Rothschild. In 1914, with the American bank situation taken care of, the First World War happened 11 years after Max Nordau talked about it and 43 years after Albert Pike had seen it in his vision. On November the 2nd, 1917, British Foreign Secretary and occultist Arthur Balfour issued the statement known as the Balfour Declaration. The declaration was addressed to Lord Rothschild, meaning the eldest son of Nathan Rothschild, Walter. It stated that Britain was in favour of establishing a Jewish settlement in Palestine. And so it was. After World War I came a peace conference held at Versailles and hosted by Edmund Rothschild. The issue of Palestine was raised at this conference, and Britain handed the land over to the Rothschilds. As well as gaining a Jewish state from the war, the League of Nations was an attempt to bond nations together en route to a one-world system. It was ineffective, however, as not enough countries accepted it at that time. And so on to the Second World War. Pike's vision stated that the outcome of this war would be to create tension between atheistic communism and Christian capitalism. Pike felt that communism would be strong enough to balance Christendom, which would be then restrained and held in check until the time we would need it for the final social cataclysm. This capitalism v communism, thesis v antithesis, indeed established itself over the next 46 years. G.K. Chesterton saw what was happening. At times, capitalism and communism would appear to be in conflict, but this writer is confident that their interests are in common and will eventually merge for one-world control. That policy outlined in Woodrow Wilson's Point 6 has never been dropped. Capitalism and communism are merely their twin mechanisms to destroy the sovereignty of Christian nations. They will merge them into the projected superstate. They are selling us into slavery and using our material resources for their own nefarious worldwide purposes. We keep seeing the same two-pronged attack idea repeated over and over, where both prongs appear to be opposing each other, but are actually just designed to bring about a third way, which is what the occultists wanted all along. Remember how occultists talk about the male and female creating a third spiritual energy, illustrated by the square and compass creating the G in the middle in Freemasonry? It's that same idea. Two opposing things coming together to create a third way. As George Hegel put it, thesis v antithesis equals synthesis. Whether it be light v dark, or male v female, Baal v Asherah, or Masonry v Catholicism, or Republican v Democrat, or in this case capitalism v communism, it's the synthesis they really want. That's what they're really after. Google the phrase third way with regard to politics, and you'll see how many modern politicians are disciples of this way of thinking. Vladimir Lenin, the communist leader, highlighted the fact that the war between capitalism and communism was just part of something much bigger when he said, "I don't care what becomes of Russia. To hell with it. All this is only the road to a world revolution." Incidentally, the Third World War in Albert Pike's vision was said to happen between the Jews and the Muslims. Pike believed that supporters on both sides, already tiring of war from previous conflicts, would fight themselves into a state of mental, physical, spiritual, and very importantly, economic exhaustion. The world would then be ready for the coming Antichrist to save them from it all. Albert Pike said of that time that, "We shall unleash the nihilists and the atheists, and we shall provoke a great social cataclysm which in all its horror will show clearly to all nations the effect of absolute atheism, the origins of savagery and of most bloody turmoil. Then everywhere the people will be forced to defend themselves against the world minority of the world revolutionaries, and will exterminate those destroyers of civilization and the multitudes, disillusioned with Christianity, whose spirits will be from that moment without direction and leadership, and anxious for an ideal, but without knowledge where to send its adoration, will receive the true light through the universal manifestation of the pure doctrine of Lucifer, brought finally out into public view. A manifestation which will result from a general reactionary movement which will follow the destruction of atheism and Christianity, both conquered and exterminated at the same time." Notice what he's saying here, that they would conquer and exterminate both Christianity and atheism at the same time. You see, the Enlightenment era that we've been studying in this third section gave birth to atheism, which was one of the hallmarks of the modern era. It was basically people trying to escape from God. But that period, defined by an increase in atheism, was only meant to be a temporary phase in the long-term plan, according to Pike. After the modern era, the world would then enter into what we now call the postmodern era, which is where we currently are today, a time in which people would move away from outright atheism towards strange religion, mystery religion. This represents the time when the mysteries would start to externalize themselves. They would gradually move out from the shadows and into the open. Mankind would come to be fed up with both Christianity and atheism, and would return to the synthesized mystery religion. In this condition, they would be ready to finally accept the manifestation of Lucifer, the Antichrist. We are already seeing this happening. Far fewer people than we realize are now outright atheists. Atheism is too cold, it's too heartless for the average person. People want to believe they'll see their friends and family again after death. And God has written eternity into our hearts, so it's a natural craving. Many have already moved towards a form of spirituality based on the occult, but which they think is wholesome and true. They often talk about being a spiritual person, but not subscribing to any specific religion. And the Bible tells us that this would happen. Paul wrote to Timothy about the last days in his second letter, saying that people would act religious, but they will reject the power that could make them godly. He also says, "For a time is coming when people will no longer listen to sound and wholesome teaching. They will follow their own desires, and will look for teachers who will tell them whatever their itching ears want to hear. They will reject the truth and chase after myths." Just to tie off one loose end before we finish this part, in 1930 the Rothschilds established the first World Bank in Switzerland. Just 4 years later, banking secrecy laws were changed in Switzerland, making it an offence punishable by imprisonment for any bank employee to violate bank secrecy. This ensured that bank secrets were kept that way, and no one really knows what goes on inside. This bank was the forerunner to the present-day IMF and the World Bank. In 1948, just 3 years after the end of World War II, the fully fledged modern state of Israel was finally born, after the Declaration of Independence was signed at Independence Hall on Rothschild Boulevard, Tel Aviv. American President and 33-degree Freemason Harry Truman was the first to officially recognize Israel as a sovereign state. Most of the rest of the world soon followed. The Israeli flag was unveiled at this time as a blue version of the hexagram. Real Jews opposed this design fiercely and suggested that their flag should instead depict a menorah, pointing out that the hexagram was not even a Jewish symbol. It has come to be known as the Star of David, but it is not mentioned in the Bible at all, and was in fact only adopted in the Enlightenment based on occult ideas from the Kabbalah. Despite the protests, the Rothschilds were in control of the operation and the hexagram stayed. Now, hexes are often used to place a curse on people. Remember, Hitler placed hexagrams on Jews during World War II to represent that they were cursed people. It's conceivable that this hexagram may be an attempt to curse the Jews. Now, here's a very important point before we finish off this third section. Many people who have studied this subject have noticed that the Rothschilds and others like them claim to be Jewish. They see how they have been the driving force behind the formation of the nation of Israel. Consequently, they have become intensely anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic, believing that the Jews are the source of the world's problems. I need to make this absolutely clear. They aren't. They really aren't. The Jews have been a huge blessing to the world, and as Christians we owe them a huge debt of gratitude. It was the Jews who faithfully recorded the words of God and preserved them in the Bible for future generations. It was through the Jews that Jesus came, our Saviour. It was Jewish apostles that spread out into the world to give us Gentiles the good news. Many of them were martyred for it. John 4:22 says that salvation comes through the Jews. Christianity is like the branches on a Jewish root. Without them, there would be no us. The Jews are still God's people. So how do we square that with these seemingly Jewish occultists behind so much evil? Well, if you've been following this study from the start, you'll be able to answer the following question. How did Satan take down God's reputation in Europe, and how did he discredit Christianity? He used fifth column tactics. He became part of the thing he wished to destroy. The Roman Catholic Church, and in particular the Jesuit order, put on a mask of Christianity and concocted evil plans under the banner of the Christian cross. That's what sickened people of God and Christianity in Europe. People saw the horrific things being done in the name of Jesus and were turned off Jesus, even though it was nothing to do with Jesus. So how would Satan look to discredit and destroy the Jews? By using the exact same fifth column tactics, by pretending to be part of the thing he wished to destroy. Satan has no new tricks. He would use people who pretend to be Jews and who through their actions would sicken the world of them. In Revelation 2:9 we read, I know about your suffering and your poverty, but you are rich. I know the blasphemy of those opposing you. They say they are Jews, but they are not, because their synagogue belongs to Satan. In Revelation 3:9 we read, Look, I will force those who belong to Satan's synagogue, those liars who say they are Jews but are not, to come and bow down at your feet. They will acknowledge that you are the ones I love. Remember the explicit words of Theodor Herzl that it would aid their plans to stoke the fires of anti-Semitism and to have people turn on the Jews. These so-called Jews are not Jews at all, just like the Catholics were not Christians at all. They are pretending to be the thing they wish to destroy. Remember the Jesuit oath. Among the Reformers to be a Reformer, among the Huguenots to be a Huguenot, among the Calvinists to be a Calvinist, among the Protestants generally to be a Protestant, and even to descend so low as to become a Jew amongst the Jews. Jews and Christians are the two people groups Satan wishes to destroy because they are the only two people groups that aren't rooted in his Babylonian system. Don't listen to the lie of Satan that the Jews are the enemy. They are the root through which Christianity came. Christians have been grafted onto a Jewish vine in a sense. We owe them a debt of gratitude. When we were far from God, Jews loved us enough to bring us the message of the gospel. Now that the roles have been reversed to a certain extent, and in this time of the Gentiles as it were, where so many Jews haven't recognized their Saviour, we should love them enough to do what they did for us and bring them Jesus. Love the Jews. Don't be played by Satan's deception. As for the establishment of the Jewish state, God uses the plans of the wicked against them. He uses even evil intentions for good. Romans 8:28 tells us that God causes everything to work together for the good of those who love God. It has always been God's plan to return the Jews to Israel, and was prophesied many times in the Bible through Ezekiel and Isaiah, to name but two. But why have the Rothschilds been so keen to establish an Israeli state anyway? Why have they worked so hard for so long to regather the Jews back in one location? There seems to be one obvious conclusion, and the more I've studied it, the more this makes sense. If you gather them all in one location, it's easier to destroy them. As simple as that. The occultists think they are herding the Jews like cattle into a small area so that they can wipe them off the map in one fell swoop. We already know from our study of Islam that they believe their false Messiah can't come until all the Jews have been destroyed. We've already heard Albert Pike talking about a World War III to be centred on Muslims against Jews. Anyone who has read the Bible, particularly Ezekiel, knows that it prophesies a time when surrounding Arab nations along with Russia and others will one day surround Israel, looking to completely annihilate it. So from all angles it seems very much like this is what the occultists are up to. However, scholars of Bible prophecy will know that when the invaders surround Israel, looking to wipe it off the map, God himself will intervene and protect the Jewish people in a spectacular and terrifying fashion. The invading army will themselves be annihilated in an awesome display of power from Almighty God. They think they are plotting the destruction of the Jews, but they are in fact digging their own graves. What they intend to do to the Jews will be done to them. The troubles in the Middle East are slowly building up to that crescendo moment as we speak. Finally, we've spent a lot of time looking at human beings during the Enlightenment section, but I want to keep re-emphasizing that they are just puppets for Satan who is behind them all. Our enemy is spiritual, not physical. In 1 John 2:18 we read, "Dear children, the last hour is here. You have heard that the Antichrist is coming, and already many such Antichrists have appeared. From this we know that the last hour has come." These Antichrists are all humans trying to pave the way for the Antichrist, but they are all just princes of Tyre being controlled by the spiritual king of Tyre behind them.